clearly there is an element of truth to that. That was a motivation, undoubtedly. But we have to look at the actual effect of that provision. And if you look at 2C, all of the criteria that must be met for a weapon not to be considered a cluster bomb, all of those criteria, the technical, legal criteria, relate to these two problems of indiscriminate area effect and unexploded bombs. So, and even more important, the weapon, the definition says that not only must you meet these 5 technical legal criteria, you must be able to detect and engage a single target, you must have fewer than 10 submunitions, you must have self-destruct, electronic self-destruct, you must have electronic self-deactivation. All of these criteria, they are not enough for a weapon to be allowed. A weapon must also, the treaty says, you must have these 5, you must meet these 5 criteria in order to not have indiscriminate area effects and problems from unexploded ordnance. So we would argue, the CNC would argue, that even if a weapon meets these 5 criteria on paper, if it still causes indiscriminate area effect or severe problems from unexploded ordnance, it's still prohibited. So I guess what I'm saying is the strength of the treaty and the strength of the definition is really in our hands, and it's in the hands of progressive governments that will interpret it in a certain way. And if we interpret it strongly, then we have a very powerful tool, I would argue, for considering the broader use of all explosive weapons. So that's the first provision that I want to talk about. Maybe slightly provocative, because I know there are strong views about Article 2C. The next provision is the provision on victim assistance. So it's really remarkable, the strength of the provision, Article 5, on victim assistance. You know, this draft provision, the draft Article 5, went into the final negotiations in Dublin and came out stronger. It's unbelievable. In almost every negotiation, you get a strong text that comes in, you make it as strong as you can, because you know it's going to be attacked from all sides, and it comes out the other end weaker, but still hopefully strong enough. Article 5 on victim assistance went through the negotiations, came out strong. So, there's one key point. The victim assistance article is very good. It's comprehensive. It has a whole set of very concrete and quite measurable obligations on states. And it's really going to be a huge challenge for states, including wealthy states here in Europe, to meet these provisions. But the specific provision within the victim assistance article that I want to spend a few minutes on is the obligation to collect data on on cluster munition victims. And cluster munition victims is defined very, very broadly. So it's not just the individual directly affected, it's also their family and communities. And there's an obligation, very clear legal obligation on states to gather data about cluster munition victims, to gather data and to report on it. Now, there's also a provision in the article on victim assistance that says you cannot discriminate. A state cannot discriminate in undertaking its obligations on victim assistance between victims of cluster bombs and victims of similar trauma. So if you take these two obligations together, the obligation to collect data on all cluster munition victims and the obligation not to discriminate between cluster munition victims and victims of similar problems, then you see an obligation to collect data on all victims of armed violence, whether it's from a cluster bomb, a landmine, or any other type of trauma. This is very interesting then. If we are saying that the CCM points to, or will maybe lead to in the future, a broader global obligation on states to collect information, to measure the impact of not only cluster bombs, but all armed violence, this is absolutely central to, I think, all work on human security, armed violence, which is emerging. I don't know how on earth governments are going to comply with this obligation to gather data. And I think there will be widely varying levels of compliance with this obligation to gather data. But when we look at the broader area of work on armed violence and development, the Geneva Declaration on Armed Violence and Development, there'll be a summit in Oslo in April next year where ministers will be invited to consider the issue of armed violence and development. Against that background, I think the precedent set in the victim assistance article of the Convention on Cluster Munitions can be very powerful in moving states towards a recognition that they must measure the impact of armed violence. They must count the civilian casualties from war, just as they do count the civilian casualties from crime in their own countries. And this I think is also something that's in our hands, in the hands of civil society, to determine how powerful this victim assistance data recording obligation can be.